Keir Starmer wants to show his mettle, shaving the benefits bill, shaking up the health service, and showing a united Europe can stand up for Ukraine. This Sunday morning, we're joined in the studio by one of Starmer's key lieutenants, Wes Streeting, and Laura Trott, the Shadow Education Secretary for the Tories, is here too. What chance of peace in Ukraine? The President of Finland was at Keir Starmer's summit yesterday.
I think the chances are abysmal. I don't think Putin wants a ceasefire. Putin doesn't want a peace.
And the director of the explosive film that claimed Michael Jackson was an abuser is back with part 2 of the alleged victims' stories.
There were so many times bodyguards that worked for Michael right outside of the door when abuse was going on. There was knowledge that there was something weird.
Morning, and with me at the desk for today's programme, the broadcaster Susanna Reid, Steve Rigby, the boss of Rigby Group, one of the biggest family businesses in the country, and the playwright James Graham, who wrote Dear England and the TV hit Sherwood, among other things. Let's start, as we always do, with the news. It's a bit of a mixed bag today. Both the Sunday Times and the Observer splash on suggestions that the government won't freeze some benefit payments after all. We've been reporting that here at the BBC too. The Sunday Telegraph says the Health Secretary's war on waste is only just beginning. We'll see what he has to say in a few minutes' time. The Independent on Sunday leads on the UK military's planning for a possible peace in Ukraine. And the Mirror has the story of a British grandmother on death row in Indonesia. And take a look at these pictures.
3, 2, 1. Ignition and lift off.
A space rescue. A new crew has arrived at the International Space Station to replace the 2 American astronauts who've been stranded there since June. Look how happy they are to see that happening. More of those amazing pictures a bit later in the programme. Let's start then with the politics. Welcome to all 3 of you. Susanna, do you think the Prime Minister's in this sort of moment of trying to flex his muscles, trying to show his mettle at home, as well as everything that's been going on abroad?
Well, there's no doubt that he has developed a reputation as somebody who can operate very effectively on the international stage. But the thing is, if you ask people on the doorsteps, of course they want to back Ukraine, but at what price? And I think that if the things that he's flexing his muscles over at home, be it benefits or personal independence payments for people, if it looks like he's using welfare and cuts to welfare to pay for war, I'm not sure that's going to be popular at all.
James, you're a close observer of politics. What do you make of what's going on here and this shift? Because, you know, cutting quangos, squeezing benefits, slashing bureaucrats, those sound like quite Tory habits, don't they?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Sometimes in history, leaders have sometimes come with their project fully formed. Like if you think of Margaret Thatcher, she spoke very clearly about the radical government she wanted when she was in opposition. Other times, your mission gets thrust upon you. If you think of sort of Gordon Brown and the financial crash. I think what Keir clearly is trying to find is a story. He actually talks in those terms, finding a new story. It's actually very similar to Gareth Southgate. He spoke about England needing a new story and actually having a long-term vision rather than previously sort of just a short-term plan to paint over the car and hope for some reason it gets over the line this time. I think there's zero appetite in the country for just tinkering around the edges anymore after a decade of feeling like things just aren't working in the country. So in terms of a long-term plan, he talks about a decade of national renewal. I think we can all agree that it does require that level of reforming government. Whether the particular detail he's offering is going to unite particularly the Labour Party is another matter.
Well, that's a tricky question, isn't it? I mean, Steve, the government's clearly, we're going to hear more about this in the coming days, desperate to get more people into work. You employ thousands of people. What are the obstacles to make that happen, to get, for example, those million young people who are not in education and not in employment, to get them back into work? Why is it so tough?
I think we've got to look at the education system as a starting point. So aspiration, attainment. I've just been to 3 schools actually on Friday, and I met some great young people, but in the same schools there'll also be people that are perhaps lost and don't have role models. So I think engaging the workforce in the business community is actually a really important thing for us to consider, and those links aren't particularly well formed today.
And do you feel that the workforce that you've got as an employer is one that's fit for purpose?
I do actually. We're really lucky. We've got 9,000 people, 4,500 in the UK. They're generally quite skilled people. We're lucky to employ some really fantastic people.
OK, all three of you, great to have you with us. There'll be lots more from you through the rest of the show. Let's crack on then. A collision is coming, a government source told me, as Labour plans to slow down the spiralling of the benefits bill. Total health on spending and disability benefits for working age adults has grown from 28 billion all the way up there to see in 2030 it will be up at 76 billion pounds. Huge projections, so you can see from those numbers why the government might want to tackle the bill. But it's not necessarily going to be easy, Health Secretary, is it? As a Labour politician, did you get into politics in order to take money from some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in society?
We don't want to take money from the poorest in society. We want to support people who are the poorest and most vulnerable to make sure they've got dignity, independence and great quality of life. And, you know, I'm in many respects a product of the welfare system and a product of what an effective state could be. When I was growing up, the welfare system put food in the fridge and money in the electric meter. We had a council house, and a state education gave me every opportunity to be now sat in front of you today as a government minister responsible for our NHS and social care services. So without that support from an active state, I wouldn't be here talking to you. So I get all of that. The challenge we've got, though, and it speaks to the point James was just making about the scale of the challenge in the country. We've got 1 in 8 young people in this country not in education, employment or in training. We've got 1 in 10 people who are off work sick, and 3 million people shut out of the labour market because of long-term illness. Now, of course, there will be some people who, because of serious disability or because of chronic illness that can't be turned around, will not be able to work, and those people need to be supported.
Well, let's talk about
the welfare state's also got to be a springboard back to work, and lots of people get written off, you know,
and we'll
as
come
if
to
they
that, but on
can't
the
contribute when
specifics
they can and should and want to.
But on the specifics of this, there has been a lot of chatter and a lot of briefing in the last couple of weeks that frankly has made a lot of our viewers very nervous. There are people watching this right now who maybe have severe disabilities, who maybe cannot go to work through no fault of their own. Can you tell them this morning whether or not your reforms will mean they have less cash?
Well, we want to support people in that position. Actually, what the driving force of our reforms is 2 things. One is to make sure that those who need the help the most get the help and get the most help. And secondly, to make sure that thinking about the wide range of people that will be accessing the welfare system, to make sure there's a range of support. So, for example, if you're in mental ill health, for example, Liz Kendall and I are working together, the Work and Pensions Secretary, to integrate with mental health support in the NHS, which often is a much, let's be honest, nicer, kinder environment than people often feel when a DWP brown envelope arrives through the letterbox. There are proven models where combining those employment support and mental health support can be really quite powerful for helping people with things like anxiety.
But there's a specific question
back to work.
But there's a specific question here that is really important. There had been suggestions that you were going to freeze personal independence payments, PIPs as they're known. That's a specific benefit. There's now other briefing, including to us here at the BBC, that you've given up on that idea because some people in the Labour Party are too worried about it. Essentially, you'd be taking money from some of the most vulnerable people. So can you tell people watching today who are worried about this whether or not you are going to freeze PIP payments, or has that idea been ditched? Well,
I think the moral of the story is don't rely on briefing and speculation. Let's wait for the plans. So you're not going to do this? I haven't seen the full plans, in all honesty. I haven't seen the full plans. They haven't come to Cabinet yet. But what I do know is that the Work and Pensions Secretary wants to support people who need help the most, and we've got to make sure that there is a wider range of support and that everyone's playing their part, including me, because, you know, with those levels of illness, for example, if I can help people back to health, in many cases I'll be helping them back to work, and that's what we'll do.
But this is a really important specific point. Can you confirm that this is not going to happen? You are not going to freeze PIP payments?
Well, I haven't seen the proposals, but I think you've seen the briefing, you've seen the speculation. I think the moral of the story is wait for the plans, because of course we need to make sure make sure the welfare system is sustainable. There are 1,000 people signing on to PIP every single day. Those 3 million people who are shut out of the labour market because of long-term illness, I mean, that's a population the size of Greater Manchester. So you can see the scale of the problem. And it's a bit, as I've sort of, talk a lot to Liz Kendall, who's a good friend of mine, as I talk to her about the scale of the challenge she's facing in the welfare system and what you pointed to there, which is the long-term pressures and costs. It reminds me quite a lot of the NHS, which is if you just continue on the trajectory we are now, if you don't start to bend that curve of cost and demand on the system, it becomes unsustainable, either unaffordable, or it won't have the political support it needs from the wider country.
And we're going to come to your
NHS
NHS changes.
And so we've got to reform the system in order to make sure it's still there for people as both a safety net, but also a springboard back to work for those people who can work, want to work. The system's got to support them to get back to work.
And in terms of people who are stuck in this situation, for whatever reason, they have ended up claiming benefits. And we should also remind people, most people who claim benefits do have jobs. Most people in benefits are working. But for those people who aren't, one of the areas where you are, we understand, going to try and claw back money, who's people who've been signed off because of mental health problems. Now, in the last few days, it's interesting, the prominent neurologist, Suzanne O'Sullivan, has said there's overdiagnosis of mental health problems. Your colleague Liz Kendall, when she was here, talked about the problems of self-diagnosis when people feel that they might have a condition. Do you believe, as the Health Secretary, that too many people are being treated as sick and incapable of work for essentially struggling with what are quite normal feelings?
Well, I want to follow the evidence, and I agree with that point about overdiagnosis. But here's the other thing. I mean, mental well-being, illness, it's a spectrum, right? And
but you do think there's overdiagnosis?
I think there's an overdiagnosis, but also there are too many people being written off. And to your point about treatment, there's too many people who just aren't getting the support they need. So if you can get that support to people much earlier, then you can help people to either stay in work or to get back to work. And that's why we're recruiting 8,500 more mental health staff to make sure we can get the waiting list down, and also starting early, so making sure we've got mental health support in every primary and secondary school in the country, so we can give people that resilience and those coping skills they'll need for life.
But you do believe there's a problem with overdiagnosis. What then would your message then be to medical professionals watching this? Should they take more care to diagnose mental health conditions? What would you say to them?
To an extent, but I also think it's on us to make sure that we're giving people the tools to do the job, and that we've got the right care plans, the right pathways for patients. And that's why some of the great stuff that Liz and I have seen in Maudsley in South London, for example, where they've combined that employment support with mental health support, can be really powerful. And to be honest, it feels a lot less scary and a lot less punitive than sometimes conversations with the DWP feel. And so that is having a real impact. I think
job centres are scary, do you think?
Job centres can be scary. And look, I think there are lots of people out there, and I meet people in my advice surgery today who, when they talk about their interactions with the state, not just DWP, but the state, it's quite reminiscent of the sorts of conversations my family were having in the 1980s. So I don't think enough has moved on in that respect. I think the other thing I'd say is about the jeopardy and the poverty trap. So today, one of the things that Liz is floating is that she'll be putting forward the right to try. So there are lots of people who are in the welfare system on benefits. They'd like to go back to work. There might be a job opportunity that becomes available. But in order to take it up, when they take it up, they immediately lose all of their benefits. And if for whatever reason the job doesn't fall through, or the employer says, actually, this isn't working out, off you pop, they're not back to the benefits they had before. They're right back to square one of having to apply again, all of that anxiety, the gap between incomes, of the distance between losing your job and getting the income support that you need. And so what Liz is creating is a right to try, where you have that security of knowing you take on a job. If it doesn't work out, you don't go back to square one. You go back to the support you had before, and then you can give something else a try. So we're trying, and that's why I think we've got to look at all the package in the round, because I know there's been a lot of focus on the financial savings, and that argument is important. The sustainability is important. But fundamentally, we're a Labour government. We're the party of work. We want to support people back to work, into work, and that means making sure they've got the right support. And of course, for those who can't work,
on Tuesday, I believe.
Yeah,
so
and
we'll
for those
see
people who can't work, because whenever we talk about work, I know there are lots of people who start screaming at the telly, quite understandably, saying, I'm so disabled, I genuinely can't. And of course, those people need support, and no one would, I think, in our country, really disagree with that.
We'll see how many people are screaming on the telly on Tuesday when Liz Kendall unveils the plans in full. Let's talk then about your shake-up of the NHS in England. I wonder if you remember this.
I could be no more popular than announce the sacking of lots of managers, but that would not be the right thing to do.
Now, that was not so long ago, a few months ago, you said, I'm not going to sack lots of managers, even though it would be really popular. And now, essentially, this week, that is exactly what you're doing. You're getting rid of NHS England. You're getting rid of, I think, about 12,000 people, or what are called care boards around the country. You're doing a massive reorganisation of the health service when you always said you wouldn't.
I must say, in the last 8 months, what I've experienced in terms of how the NHS is set up and the way it works and the level of duplication, man-marking, waste, inefficiency, it has driven me to make the announcement that the Prime Minister and I made on Thursday, which is instead of having 2 head offices, which is effectively what we've got today, we'll have 1, that we'll return numbers back to where they were when Labour was last in power, delivering the shortest waiting times and the highest patient satisfaction in history, because the combined size of NHS England and the department is about double what it was. But we're not seeing the results.
But the point here is you've said in the newspapers this morning that you're now looking at hundreds of other organisations in the NHS. There'll be people who work for the NHS around the country who think, well, hang on, is my job going to be up here? Which organisations are you going to get rid of next?
Yeah, and let me just address that point, because it's an important one. Although lots of people working in the NHS will agree that there are too many layers of bureaucracy, that the way in which the system works is often inefficient, and actually lots of frontline staff are the first to complain about the waste and inefficiency because they're working in it, they're experiencing it, and they care about it. They want to see that money put where it's needed. There are also lots of good people in my department and in NHS England. They're set up to fail. I'm going after the bureaucracy, not the people who work in it. And of course, I can't sugarcoat the fact that there will be a significant number of job losses.
So how many
and we will want to make sure we're treating people fairly, supporting them properly through that process. And I'm not criticising them, but I've got to make sure the system is well set up, because I'm presiding over an NHS at the moment where ambulances don't arrive on time, where people can't get a GP appointment when they need one, when NHS dentistry barely exists in parts of the country. These are big, fundamental problems. And we've got to make sure that every penny is put in the right place, that the system is geared up to set people to succeed. And we've got to eliminate this idea that the NHS can be commanded and controlled from nationally on everything. We've got to give far more resource, power and control to the front line.
But you, as the Health Secretary, are taking on more power. You are centralising more power in the Department of Health. And you are saying things like you're going to get rid of hundreds of organisations. So I'll ask you again, which other organisations are you going to get rid of? Because you've just said that you want to treat staff fairly. It's not about going after staff. But then you write in the newspapers you're going to get rid of hundreds of organisations without giving any detail. So which organisations are going to go?
We'll shortly be publishing the findings of Dr Penny Dash, who did a big review of the way in which we regulate in the NHS. There is an over-regulation. Frontline NHS leaders are complaining to me that they could deliver better care for patients and they could deliver better value for taxpayers, but they are often receiving a barrage of commands, sometimes contradictory and competing demands from the Department for Health, from NHS England and from the wide range of regulators in this space. If we can simplify this, it's always a complicated system, it's a complex system, but if we can simplify as much as we can and do away with this idea that everything in a system this vast, this big, can be commanded and controlled with levers being pulled in Westminster and Whitehall, we'll be setting up the NHS to succeed. And that's why, actually, yes, I will be taking on the responsibility I think the Secretary of State should always have had. And let's be honest, it's not like in a few years' time, if we kept NHS England, your viewers would be saying, well, the NHS is a mess, but it's not his fault, it's NHS England. The Secretary of State always gets the blame. But it's important I've got the right levers to pull, and crucially, I'm going to give away as much power, responsibility and resource as I can closer to the front lines. I genuinely think that's where the innovation and reform comes.
The tricky thing, though, is you, in opposition, said you weren't going to embark on a huge reorganisation of the NHS. Now here you are in government embarking on a huge reorganisation of the NHS. And we've all seen big reorganisations of the NHS before. This is what the King's Fund said about this. Now, they are the real health experts. They're independent and they study these things carefully. They say reorganisations take far longer than you think. They end up costing far more than you anticipated and leave you with a distracted and demoralised workforce. Now, what difference are patients actually going to see? Can you promise people that their care isn't going to be disrupted when you've got all these organisational changes, getting rid of staff, moving things around?
I think freeing up hundreds of millions of pounds a year...
Well, it's going to cost you a lot to start with.
Of course, there are always upfront costs. And yes, there is always a risk of disruption. And these are all of the reasons why nothing in this country has changed for years, because politicians who've been sat in this chair before have not been prepared to take on those sorts of challenges because of a quiet life. And in fact, this NHS England was set up to shield politicians like me from responsibility and accountability to delivering what the public wants. And freeing up hundreds of millions of pounds a year is worth it. Trying to slim down the national bureaucracy and give more power closer to the front line where real change happens, where real services are provided, and real change is delivered, that is the prize worth having. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done it. As your quotes show, I didn't come into this job thinking what I really want to do is a big top-down reorganisation. In fact, I came in absolutely determined to see how things were working first, to make a judgment and make an assessment of how the system's working. And I've seen waste, inefficiency and duplication. So, of course, I should go after that. And, of course, we should make the system run as effectively and as efficiently as we could. Because look at the state of it.
Can you promise people that what you've essentially said this morning, you are now doing a huge reorganisation, can you promise people that the care they receive won't be disrupted? Because every time there's been organisations of the NHS before and things being moved around, there has been an impact on care. You used to criticise that yourself.
Yeah, I can make sure, and I will deliver the improvements month on month, year on year. We've got NHS waiting lists falling 5 months in a row, and that was during peak winter pressures.
When NHS England still existed, they delivered that success for you.
Yeah, and the person who I've put in charge of the NHS transformation, Sir Jim Mackey, is widely respected, and he is someone who has driven those improvements in waiting times and performance. But with respect to all of the people in NHS England and in my department who are dedicated public servants, good at what they do, they are working in a setup which I think people, including the people who work in it, would recognise is not efficient, does involve duplication, isn't supporting the system well enough. And that is why, notwithstanding lots of care and sympathy for the people whose jobs are affected, actually, on the front line of the NHS, there are lots of people saying, about time someone took this on, because they can see that there is this mountain of accountability. And while I may now sit at the peak of that mountain of accountability as Secretary of State, when people say there's too much bureaucracy, when people say there's too much top-down command and control, when people say there's too much waste, not only do I recognise that criticism from the environment I work in. I agree with it, and I'm going to do something about it.
OK, well, it'll be fascinating to see how it proceeds in the coming months. Let's just lastly have a brief word about Ukraine. Keir Starmer gathered European leaders together yesterday, again, talking about his coalition of the willing. And he said something I think a lot of people might have been intrigued by. He said, we're moving to an operational phase. Can you tell our viewers what that actually means in real terms? Does it mean that the UK is now preparing its troops, our military, to go to be part of a peacekeeping situation in Ukraine? What does it mean?
Yeah, I think there are two things going on. One is winning the peace, and the second is planning to secure the peace. So peace hasn't been negotiated and won yet. Obviously, we heard from President Zelensky and President Trump a willingness to reach an agreement with Russia. The ball is now in Russia's court on the peace, and I dare say this will be a fast-moving situation in the coming days. But you also need to make sure, particularly given the kind of tyrant we're up against, bearing in mind Putin started this war, he is occupying a sovereign country. There was no justification for this whatsoever, and we know this is a guy who pushes the boundaries in every way. So you've got to make sure that if you reach a peace agreement, that it can be secured. And that's what the Prime Minister has been working with international allies to do, to make sure we are all ready to play our part, to make sure that Ukraine has not just its democracy, its sovereignty, its freedom and independence, but it has its security as well, and that's what the Prime Minister's working on.
And we'll be hearing from one of the allies involved in those conversations a bit later in the programme. But Secretary of State for Health, Wes Streeting, thanks very much indeed for being with us this morning. Always good to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, remember, we want to know what you think. As ever, you can email us, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or if you're social media inclined, you can use the hashtag #BBC and the WhatsApp number is up there on the screen for you too. Well then, Steve, what did you make of what you had to hear? I mean, Wes Streeting seems to be a real convert to this idea of reorganising the NHS, doesn't he?
I like some of it, if I'm honest with you. I like change. The country is stuck, and we're stuck in an environment where we have a nanny state, if we're being honest. The expectation of people probably are too great in relation to the revenue we can generate. So some change has to happen. And some of that change will come through reform. And this is a start. It's got a long way to go. We shouldn't lose sight, Laura. This is the biggest organisation in the UK. 1.5 million people, 180 billion of revenue. It's a gargantuan organisation. So I think change is required. It needs digitisation, technology needs to come through. But they're starting. And as you said this morning, you know, they're doing something that perhaps politicians have avoided doing. So you know, it's the start of a journey. There's lots to achieve, but personally, I welcome it.
Susanna, what did you think of what he had to say?
I think it's very interesting. We on Good Morning Britain have been inundated with concern from viewers about the welfare cuts.
Changes, yeah.
And Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, says, well, don't get upset about all of the sources and briefing and all of that sort of, stuff that you've been hearing in the run-up to the Green Paper.
Things that have been briefed by people inside the government often.
But given the opportunity to knock down people's concerns, he didn't. He didn't rule out the fact that personal independence payment will be frozen or cut. He did say that those with the most severe disabilities will still be supported. But people on PIP explain that, we had a charity talking to us on the programme this week, which say if you have a disability, it can cost an extra £1,000 a month simply to live your life. And so the anxiety that has been triggered by all of those sources and briefings has been enormous. People with terminal cancer wondering if their PIP payment's going to be frozen or cut. People with cerebral palsy, people with bipolar, people with chronic mental health conditions. And I think the government, a Labour government, he pointed out it's a Labour government, should come out and say, these are the people who do not need to worry.
James, do you think the government is taking a risk with all of this here?
I do, yeah. I mean, I think obviously most people can't necessarily always identify or articulate organisational structures or delivery mechanisms. It's not the sexy side of politics. I don't think I'm going to be writing,
write a play about integrated care boards.
Public sector reform, the musical, anytime soon. But obviously what they do feel, as you spoke about, patients do feel the outcomes of that. And I, like Steve said, I admire people asking bigger philosophical questions about, yes, it's going to take about 2 years to do this organisational restructure, but I would rather those conversations happen now rather than short-term answers to long-term problems.
It's interesting that you mentioned before Gareth Southgate's leadership, and of course you wrote the play about that, Dear England, which is now going on a nationwide tour, I think, and then coming to TV soon. But I know that, you said Keir Starmer took an interest in that. Do you think that he's changing as a leader?
I wouldn't presume to know, but I do think I know that he actually saw the play, and I know that he's always been a Southgate curious person in terms of how somebody did sort of change the fundamentals of an organisation, and not just in terms of its immediate performance, but famously what Gareth Southgate did was look at the culture and the mindset and the environment of a place, and those things, again, as we just said, those aren't the immediately eye-catching sexy stuff, but it does in the long term create something of a more fundamental shift.
But are football managers good role models, do you think, Steve? Have you looked at a football manager and thought,
it's a mixed bag, I would say, out there.
But do you have faith in what the government's doing?
I think they're in the early days. I'm pleased the last few weeks have been a lot better. We've had some pretty bumpy weeks, I have to say, since they came into power. And it feels finally in the last few weeks that there is some traction. And big announcements at the start of that. So, I welcome the change. We're talking about going from 2 million people on PIPs to 4.3 million during the next 5 years. We just have to be realistic. Is this sustainable? Have we got the right mechanisms in place? It isn't a case of not supporting somebody. It's a case of finding the right way to support them.
And that's the difficulty, though, isn't it, Susanna? The governments, successive governments have said they want to try and tackle this, but what they want to do is support people. But there's always carrot and stick, and the stick might cause a lot of political trouble.
I think it might cause a lot of political trouble for people who voted for a Labour government, but then found that they were voting for a tax on work in the form of higher national insurance employment payments, cutting winter fuel allowance to millions of pensioners, to cuts to the foreign aid development budget, despite the fact that in the manifesto they said that their aim would be to eventually increase it, and now to cut welfare. I mean, I just find it really interesting that you have, a Labour minister on who has to keep redefining what a Labour government is, because I think a lot of people think, is this it?
Very interesting. Well, politics never stands still, does it? And we must talk now about Ukraine. So how willing is Starmer's coalition of the willing? We were just discussing it briefly with Wes Streeting. Alexander Stubb is the president of Finland. He was one of the leaders who was on the call with Keir Starmer yesterday talking about their plans, and I spoke to him shortly afterwards.
We're willing to do concrete measures overall, but I think for our perspective, it's too early to talk about boots on the ground because we don't have a ceasefire, we don't have a peace process. And you also have to remember that Finland has 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia. So we take care of the northern flanks, but there's so many different ways that we can help out. And I'm really glad that we're seeing strong leadership coming from the UK.
But in what concrete ways are you willing to help out if, as you say, it's too early to talk about actually troops being part of peace efforts?
Well, there are two phases here. The first one is the military planning, which is going on right now, and it'll continue actually in London on Thursday. And then after that, once we have a clear plan, we start doing the commitments. But there are anywhere from 0 to 50 different ways they can help out. Boots on the ground is only one way. You can talk about intelligence, you can talk about different types of things, but it's too early to commit right now.
Can you see any signs that Vladimir Putin is actually willing to enter into serious negotiations? President Zelensky says Putin's afraid to tell Donald Trump that he wants to carry on with the war. What chances are, do you think, that the Kremlin is paying a blind bit of attention to any of this?
I think the chances are abysmal. I don't think Putin wants a ceasefire. Putin doesn't want a peace. His original aim was basically to destroy the independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, basically to have Ukraine ceasing to exist. He hasn't changed his aim, and this is what all of us around the table have to understand. That's why we have to maximize the pressure on Putin, which means more sanctions, which means using the frozen assets, and which actually means militarizing Ukraine to the teeth.
So if the chances are abysmal, to use your phrase, that President Putin wants to actually take anything seriously here, is he just playing Donald Trump? Because Donald Trump seems to think he can get him to the table. So is he being taken for a ride?
Don't underestimate the capacity of the President of the United States, Donald Trump, to negotiate a deal. I'm sure many things will happen in the coming days, and I'm sure that we'll be moving in the right direction. I don't think Putin should be playing with Trump. That's, I think, quite self-evident.
What do you mean about things happening in the coming days?
Well, I think there's a lot of shuttle diplomacy going on, a lot of phone calls, a lot of aims to move things forward. We need to start seeing some activity coming from Russia pretty soon. Otherwise, I'm sure that President Trump will stamp his foot down.
And what might President Trump stamping his foot look like?
I think you have to ask the President of the United States that. I think one of the good things in these negotiations that he's genuinely trying to find peace. He has said so many times that he wants to stop the killing. And I can tell you as a Finn, in World War II, which for us was the Winter War and the War of Continuation, we fought the Soviets for about 1,200 days in total, which is pretty much what the Ukrainians have been fighting so far. We kept our independence, but we lost our sovereignty and we lost our territorial integrity. And that is simply not a predicament that Ukraine should suffer. That's why we continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes.
That's interesting because that process, sometimes known as Finlandization, is one of the things that appears to have been dangled by the United States to end the war, have a neutral Ukraine without clear security guarantees. But in your view, that would just be unacceptable. That's not a goer.
Completely unacceptable. Finlandization was a predicament put down to us after Stalin's peace in 1944. Basically, it robbed us of our just way of being in the international organizations where we want it to be. Ukraine needs to have the right to decide whether it wants to join the European Union or not. It needs to have the right to decide whether it wants to join NATO or not. So Finlandization is absolutely a no-go, no solution whatsoever for Ukraine.
By virtue of your country's history and, of course, your geography, you know all too well what the threat of Russia can look like. But President Trump seems to have downplayed that, saying in the White House that Russian aggression was done. How does it feel watching this from Finland? Do you feel that it's over?
Well, we can't change our geography, but we can learn lessons from history. And the lesson is that we've had over 30 wars or skirmishes with Russia since the 1300s. But the other lesson is that you can also learn to live with Russia. But when Russia continues its war of aggression in Ukraine, when it continues to think that it's a big power that can have spheres of interest in Europe, then all of us are in trouble. And the only thing that Russia understands is power.
Mr. President, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
My pleasure.
It's very meaningful always to hear directly from countries who are much closer geographically to Russia than we are. But Steve, you know, running a big business, the government recently has made a lot of making the connection between what happens with Ukraine to what's happening here. But for you as a businessman, what's the connection?
I think the first thing I'd say is that from a negotiation stance point of view, we've got Trump in a hurry and we've got Putin who's not in a hurry. I think setting a more realistic timescale for peace is required. If we don't, unfortunately, they'll lose Ukraine. So I think that sort of business experience and negotiation tells me you can't have two parties, especially because the vested interests are different, not being aligned. So I think we have to set a more realistic goal. Once we get through it, and let's hope for the people of Ukraine that we do, I think we could see an economic bounce. You know, we'll see a reduction in energy prices, more confidence around the world, clearly a rebuilding of Ukraine and the opportunity that brings. A rearmament, and not everyone agrees with that, but a rearmament of Europe.
That will change the economy
too.
It will
change the economy. So yeah, this is a really important moment for the world. It's clearly very important for Ukraine, but I think for the world, this is actually a very key moment.
James, what of Britain's role? I mean, do you think that it's changed in the last few months?
Definitely. I think everyone sort of recognises and appreciates whatever else there's been, the moral clarity of the leadership at the moment, especially when that's been absent in certain other Western leaders' behaviour. And it's obviously a tricky line to balance when you need partners across the world and trade agreements and things. But I think, I mean, I've never personally been able to watch the entirety of that clip of Zelensky and Vance and Trump. I find it like impossibly upsetting, the bullying that went on there, and also the very, very chilling Orwellian rewriting of basic fundamentals, who started what when, you know, in dramatic terms, like confusing the good guys with the bad guys. It is a very worrying moment. I think people will always therefore be grateful for the reasserting of our traditional values when they come, and hopefully it will, as Steve says, it will work out for the people of Ukraine.
Susanna, you mentioned briefly though in our opening conversation that people at home don't necessarily ever reward governments for what they might do on the world stage. Do you think there's a risk that the government might get distracted? Or, you know, we have seen in the past that prime ministers get quite used to enjoying sometimes the sort of grandeur of diplomacy, and can sometimes, I'm not saying that's what's happening here, but can sometimes take their eye a bit off what's happening at home.
Well, I think, you know, everyone will be grateful to the Prime Minister if what he does helps to secure peace. I've been out to Ukraine. I've interviewed President Zelensky's wife about the total devastation and trauma to the people of Ukraine of Russia's invasion. So whatever we can do and the part we can play in securing that will be celebrated. But the cost will be what Sir Keir Starmer has to keep his eye on. And we know that it's already had a massive impact on, for instance, fuel bills, energy bills. We have been promised that those bills will come down. Those bills are on the way up again.
Well, we know that everybody watches their energy bills very, very carefully because of all the ups and downs of the last few years. We'll be back with you towards the end of the programme, but thank you for now. Now, you know we've talked a lot on Sunday mornings, not just about energy bills and Ukraine, but about the upsides and the downsides of technology, especially when it comes to how our children use phones. This week in Parliament, the Conservatives are going to try to ban phones in school. They're going to try to change the law. Laura Trott, the Shadow Education Secretary is the person behind that idea. Great to have you with us for the first time in this job. Why are you going to take this move?
We think this is incredibly important. When we were in government, we introduced guidance to schools which said that phones shouldn't be in the classroom. However, that hasn't worked. We know that only 11% of schools have proper smartphone bans in place. We know 1 in 5 children are disrupted every single day because of phones in the classroom. So now it is time to make it law. We're introducing an amendment to the Schools and Wellbeing Bill on Monday, and we hope that Labour will put politics aside and vote for this because it's the right thing to do.
But I remember when Gillian Keegan was the Education Secretary for the Conservatives, and she sat in that chair and said it's basically up to head teachers, we don't need to have a legal ban. And I know also you believe in school freedom, so why don't head teachers have the right to decide what's best?
Well, we also believe very strongly in safeguarding, and this is a safeguarding measure. We've also tried the guidance, and it was right to try the guidance first, but we were always clear that we would legislate if it didn't work. It is clearly not working for the reasons that I've set out, and that is why teachers, parents and pupils across the country are asking for this ban, and that's why I hope that the House will come together on Monday and vote for our amendment.
But are schools asking you to do this?
Yes, head teachers, when I go into schools, head teachers are asking for this. This is something that they need to help them to implement the ban in the face of opposition sometimes from certain parents. And also what we've seen when I go into schools which have these kind of bans, the pupils love it. They talk about how much safer it makes them feel. They talk about how they have the freedom to learn. They're not under any pressure to be on their phones responding to apps. It makes such a difference. And at a time when we are facing lots of challenges in our education system, introducing something which reduces distraction, encourages reading, helps with behaviour, for me is an absolute no-brainer. And that's why I think it was wrong that the Education Secretary called it a gimmick.
Do you think, though, you've got a remote chance of actually making this happen? Because Labour has an enormous majority. There are some Labour MPs who've talked about this, but do you think you've got a chance of making it happen?
I think what I've got to do is to make the argument. As I'm doing with the schools bill more broadly about how damaging it is, I've got to make the argument. I've got to come on shows like yours and encourage parents, teachers, children up and down the country to petition their MPs to vote for this, because it is incredibly important. It will make a massive difference.
OK, well, let's see what happens. You mentioned there the rest of the government's bill on education, which is making its way through Parliament. Now, one of the things they're doing is making academies in England, which are schools that are not run by councils. You believe that the government is wrong to make them have teachers who've got the official qualification. Surely it's absolutely right that all teachers have an official qualification.
There's a bill that's going through the House of Commons at the moment, the schools bill, and it's a bill of 2 halves. Half of which is about safeguarding that we agree with. The second half, which is the bit you're talking about, Laura, which is about academies, is the policy equivalent of a wrecking ball. It undermines everything cross-party that we've agreed on that improves schools over the past couple of decades, a consensus which has led to English children being the best at reading and maths in the Western world.
I'm asking you about a specific here,
no,
because
absolutely,
part
and
of this bill is to say that academy schools should have every teacher having a proper official qualification. And at the moment, they don't have to do that. And the government's not suggesting anybody who's already a teacher, maybe they were somebody who was in the army or they came to teaching late, they're not suggesting that those people should lose their jobs. What they're saying is that new teachers being hired by academies should all have an official qualification. Surely that's what every parent would want.
Well, firstly, I don't think the legislation is tight enough on teachers who are existing in schools without qualifications won't be fired at the moment, but we'll come to that. On the broader point, most teachers do have qualifications. However, there are some subjects whereby, for example, in PE, I talk to academy leaders. They have brought in brilliant coaches from outside who've had fantastic success with sports teams. They've come in to teach PE. I don't think most people watching this programme would think that that is a big problem.
Wouldn't they want teachers to have proper qualifications, though? Because being a sports coach, noble job, it's not the same as being a teacher, is it? It's not
but they also get training on the job as well. And we know that these teachers have been successful. And with so much of this bill is what is the problem that they are trying to solve? There is no issue at the moment with unqualified teachers causing a problem in schools. They are doing things which they think sound good or things that the unions have asked them for, but will be incredibly damaging to schools, because it's not just teachers they're trying to ban. They're trying to take away a swathe of academy freedoms, which have led to English children being the best in the world, in the Western world, at reading and maths.
What's your evidence that it would be damaging for schools to have every teacher have a qualification? What's your evidence that actually every school should have to follow the national curriculum and that would be a bad thing? On both of those issues, Don't parents want to know that their children are learning the right things? Don't parents want to know that all the teachers are qualified?
Well, I'll tell you the broad piece of evidence. I'll go into those two specifics. So the broad piece of evidence is in Wales, we have not had the changes to academies which we've had in England. We've not had the robust curriculum that we've seen in England. As a result of that, English children in disadvantaged areas are as good at reading and maths as deprived children. Sorry, let me get this right. Apologies, say it again. So children from deprived areas in England are as good as the average in Wales. There has been a significant improvement in England. That has not happened in Wales, and that is because of the policies that have taken place in England, which are the ones that we've talked about here today. On those two specific points that you talk about, on teachers, as I've said, we've got a real problem with teacher recruitment at the moment. This is going to make it worse. On the national curriculum, most schools follow the national curriculum. However, when failing schools are taken over, for example, many academy chains use the academy freedoms to focus on literature and on maths. I don't think that is a problem. It's been proven to improve schools. Why take it away?
In terms of what else is coming up this week beyond education, we've talked a lot about the welfare changes. As a Conservative, you've got, the Labour government getting rid of quangos, tightening up welfare payments. You must be quite pleased about those things. Are you going to back the Labour proposals on welfare when they come?
So I think on welfare, I was Chief Secretary at the time of the election, and I remember the Labour Party saying that there was no money to be saved from welfare whatsoever. There was not a welfare bill in their first King's speech. They're all over the place at the moment, divided and without a plan.
But are you going to back them?
Well, let's see what they come forward with. I mean, we're not clear at all what the plan is. Wes, when he was talking to you just now, he's not seen the plan. So let's see what it is. We, of course, support the principle of welfare reform, but this is something that they could have been underway with altogether, and they're all over the place.
Would you back a freeze in personal independence payments?
Let's see what they come forward with.
OK, Laura Trott, thank you very much indeed for coming. Great to have you with us for the first time in your new job. OK. Now, Michael Jackson was an icon, but 6 years ago, allegations about him sexually abusing children exploded into public in the film Leaving Neverland. The singer died in 2009 and had always denied any of those kinds of allegations. But the alleged victims, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, have not given up their legal fight. Leaving Neverland 2 tells their story. The director of both films is Dan Reed, who stopped by yesterday.
There were so many times bodyguards that worked for Michael right outside of the door when abuse was going on, whether that was at Neverland or in trailers, at a recording studio. Always people around that worked for him. There was knowledge that there was something weird going on, and nobody in the organization seemingly did anything about it.
This second film is the story of the 10 or 12 year long dogged journey to get their day in court against the organisation which they say enabled and facilitated and covered up the abuse. So, making them, basically bringing them to Jackson, making sure their parents were, some distance away or kept at one remove. Just enabling the whole thing while they say, and their lawyers say, people around Jackson must have known. They must have known something weird was happening.
So it's a real David and Goliath battle now between these two alleged victims and this huge, big corporate entity, which is now the Michael Jackson estate. Now, in this moment, there's your film, but there's a massive blockbuster biopic coming out about him. There's a Michael Jackson musical. Is there more at stake now than there was last time round because of, if you like, a sort of revival of him that we're seeing?
Yeah, there is more at stake. I mean, now, as you say, there are this monetization of Jackson's work, which has been very successful, which wasn't really knocked off course by the first film. There was a temporary blip, but more and more people, including, I think, younger people now, coming to Jackson's music. And he was an amazing entertainer. He was an amazing musician. But there are more and more opportunities to monetize his work. And that's where people, the fans, accuse James and Wade of being gold diggers and say it's all about the money. Well, it is all about the money that the estate is making from Jackson's work. And what James and Wade are saying threatens to, I suppose, take the shine off Jackson's reputation.
How does it feel for them, the alleged victims, to see Hollywood and the industry continue to be cashing in on his talent and his legacy, despite the allegations that people have heard for many, many years?
I think that's it's a little depressing. It's sad to see, particularly for Wade and James. I mean, no one, including me, has ever advocated cancelling him. But what they're trying to get is, through their legal journey, which began long before I met them, is try to have official public acknowledgement of the fact that he was a predator. And every time they see a poster, and every time, down the road in the West End, you see those massive posters for the musical, and you see parents with children in the queue, and you sort of think, what are you doing? Are you completely unaware? But, in the end, people should be able to continue listening to his music, but also accept the fact that he was a danger to children. The fans' argument goes, well, he made beautiful music and he was a great entertainer, therefore he can't be a paedophile. And unfortunately, that's quite a weak argument. What
his defenders, though, would say, and his still many millions of fans around the world might feel, is, look, the man has passed away. He's not here to defend himself against any of the allegations that are still being made. He faced multiple allegations of abuse during his lifetime. He was never convicted of anything. So what's this really about then for the alleged victims still pursuing this now in the civil case, and we expect a trial sometime in 2026?
Yeah, I mean, it's about, for Wade and James, it's about getting public recognition of the fact that this icon was in fact a sexual predator who preyed on very, very young children, because that's affected them so personally and so directly. And they've been on this journey where Wade was a witness at Michael Jackson's criminal trial, and he was defence witness #1, and he was an excellent witness in favour of Jackson. And then, of course, once he had his own child, a baby child, he realised that his relationship with Jackson as a child, his sexual relationship, had been unhealthy, had been abused. And they believe that's an important thing for people to understand. They think, and I think we all know, that there's a lot of child sexual abuse that happens in the entertainment industry. Jimmy Savile here in the UK is a case in point. And if they can have a California jury accept that this is what happened and hold the company that they say enabled the abuse liable, then it might change things in the entertainment industry. I think that's a big mission that they feel they have to see through to the end. And, if they'd wanted money, as the estate and the fans claim, they could have just gone for a payoff. That's what so many of the other victims, we know of 10 now. When Leaving Neverland came out, victims came forward and went to the estate and they were paid off again. So if James and Wade really wanted an easy life and just some quick money, they could have just gone to the estate and said, give me some cash.
Well, you can watch that film, Leaving Neverland 2, on Channel 4 on Tuesday. And if you've been affected by any of those kinds of issues, there is a lot of help available. You can see the address of the BBC Action Line website there if you want to go, and you can find all sorts of organisations who can support you. Now then, let's look ahead as we come to the end of the programme, because it's not just this political week when there's going to be all these conversations about welfare happening, but in 10 days' time, the spring statement. Now, it's not a budget, but it is a moment when the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, will stand up at the dispatch box with her plans, the official state of the economy, and potentially a real squeeze on lots of bits of spending. Steve, you run lots of businesses, employ lots of people. This week, we're told the economy shrank. But what's your take on what's really going on? Because it can be so hard to really understand what's happening, because the figures point in all sorts of different directions.
They're all backward-looking, obviously, as well, which is part of the challenge. So I think the positive is, I think that sentiment from business is improving. I suspect in the surveys we're all being quite harsh because everyone's quite frustrated with where government was through the budget.
What, they're all cross about national insurance?
People are angry. So giving positive messages in survey sentiments is not what you're going to do right now. But the underlying trend of business, I think, is improving. I think the comprehensive spending review in June will help that. So for those of us that have large public sector businesses, which makes up a large part of the economy, I think that's going to lift. I mean, there's been almost paralysis in some departments. So on the positive, I think there's a better sentiment. On the negative, unfortunately, the government keeps pulling reverse gear levers. So yes, we're looking at regulation, which we welcome. Yes, we're looking at planning reform, but these are changes 2-3 years out from now. In the short term, the Employment Rights Bill, which has just gone through another reading in the House this week, reintroduction of further unionisation in businesses that perhaps don't need it, day one workers' rights. These, unfortunately, they're nothing but reverse gears. Even the government recognised 2 to 5 billion of negative impact. So where's the short-termism? Where are those levers?
But ministers, when they come in here, they say actually things like the Employment Right Bill, giving rights to workers, that's a good thing. It won't have a drag on the economy. You're saying it will.
It can't do anything other than drag the economy. Unfortunately, if you're a 5-person SME, one person really matters. It's 20% of your workforce. And if you make a mistake in that situation with employing that person with day one rights, and that person immediately in this bill has flexibility of where they work, the hours they work, is that really practical for a 5-person SME business? Maybe when you're my size, you can cope with these things. But for lots of businesses that make up, there are 5 million SMEs, 1.5 million employed people. For those organisations, this is really crippling.
Susanna, how big a moment do you think it's going to be for Rachel Reeves in 10 days' time?
Yeah, huge. She's under an enormous amount of pressure. Cost of living does not seem to be easing, and people still want to see more teachers in schools and a better education for their children. They want to be able to see a GP more quickly. They want to see more police officers on the streets. These are all promises that have been made. They want to see that happen.
And in terms, James, of the politics of this, Labour has had a pretty grim start to their government. They seem to, as Steve was suggesting, have a new mojo in the last few weeks. But how do you think they're actually going to be able to turn around the public's opinion of them? Because the polls are pretty dreadful, and politicians will all tell you, don't pay any attention to one poll. But there is a relentless reality for Labour that they are not, as it stands, a popular government. When do you think they could turn that round?
I mean, it's all about storytelling, isn't it, often? Actually, no, it's about results and then how you frame those results. But I mean, I think, sorry to keep returning to Margaret Thatcher, I wrote a TV drama about her recently, so she's in my head. But, I remember the first 2 years of her government were very difficult. Her poll rating plummeted to, I think, the most unpopular Prime Minister of all time in the first 2 years. You would never have suspected that she would go on to transform the country as she did. Reasonable, people can agree, for better or worse. But that was a defining decade in our lives. So sometimes it does take time. But I would say, as someone who is obsessed about narratives and storytelling, I do feel we are still lacking a very clear story that we can all unite behind and get behind. So
if you were to write their story, then what would you be? If Number 10 called you next week and said, come in, give us a script, what would you say?
I'm very busy at the moment, so I probably wouldn't get involved. But I mean, look, I think, as everyone has been saying, there is, after a very, very tough decade in our national life, where the genuine suffering, the low-wage economy, austerity affecting all of our faith in public services, people just are really, really miserable and things are really tough. And I think at some point, recognising the scale of the challenge and the difficult decisions that are having to be made financially to balance the books is going to have to be replaced with a really, really positive and hopeful story where we can believe that there's going to be incremental change year by year and we can start feeling more positive about our society.
OK, well, all three of you, thank you for giving us your take on the stories with us this morning. Dear England is on at the National Theatre at the moment still, and then going off to Salford before touring around the country.
Nailed it. There we go.
Well, there we are.
Thank
I did
you.
it for you. Thank you, all three of you, very much indeed. And thank you to you as well for getting in touch. You've been emailing in on some of the government's welfare reforms. Sue Pillmore says, I know a lot of people don't work, but I am really worried about how I will get by financially if I lose my PIP. Carol Stanhope says, one way to get the numbers down would be to treat people sooner and make them well. But Ian French has a different idea. He told us the government needs to focus on getting the 16 to 25-year-olds into work and off benefits. And in the last few minutes, a teacher who's been listening to Laura Trott writes in saying teachers think qualifications are important. Too many academies are using teaching assistants to teach to save money. Always great to hear your views, and you'll hear more of them in our newsletter on Thursday. You can sign up to that online. Thank you to my team at the desk. Thank you to you, most of all, for spending your Sunday morning with us when we've been talking a bit about the government's huge task abroad, but those creeping problems at home that all the international summits in the world cannot make disappear. You can catch up with anything you missed on iPlayer. I'll be with Paddy O'Connell on BBC Sounds for a newscast a bit later. And I will look forward to seeing you next Sunday, same time, same place. But as we go, as promised, remember the 2 NASA astronauts stranded in space for 9 months on what was supposed to be an 8-day mission? Well, a crew has finally arrived to replace them. Hugs all round, as we can show you, and they are almost on their way home. Imagine what that must feel like. Here they are. Goodbye.
Crew 10 taking their first steps outside as they prepare for their journey to the International Space Station.
Dragon has successfully docked to the International Space Station.